Information and Technology Consultant for the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, where he works on the project Toolkit for Responsible AI Innovation in Law Enforcement. He's also an Associate Research Fellow with the AI Ethics Research Group at the Center for Artificial Intelligence Research, University of Pretoria. Dr. Segun has published widely in areas such as AI, data and computational ethics, algorithmic audit, responsible AI, and technology policy. He is the editor of selected issues in the ethics of AI and conversations on African philosophy of mind, consciousness, and AI. We're happy to have you here, Dr. Segun. And the last speaker is Dr. Tanya De Villiers Botha, and she's a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at Stellenbosch University. She's also the head of the unit for the ethics of technology in the Center for Applied Ethics and the coordinator of the Data and Computational Ethics Research Group, and a member of the Global AI Ethics Consortium of the Institute of Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, Technical University of Munich. Our research interests include philosophy of mind and cognitive science, meta-ethics, and the epistemology and ethics of AI. We're happy to have you here, Dr. Tanya. So I'm just going to open the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Chinasa Okolo. Over to you. And so all speakers will have 20 minutes each of presentation. And yeah, so
okay,
thank you.
No worries. All right, let me make sure I get the right desktop. Okay. All right, so really happy to be here. And thank you again to the African Studies Center team for the invitation. I'm actually born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, so I'm happy to be presenting at KU. So I'll get started into my presentation. All right. As AI development and efforts towards regulating these systems are increasingly becoming centralized in Western countries, despite the impacts of AI transcending borders, Western corporations at the frontier, quote unquote, of AI development are largely reliant on the African continent for natural resources like tantalum, cobalt, and tungsten, which form the GPUs powering large AI models, also commonly referred to as foundation models. Human resources like data annotation and content moderation labor, which are used to train AI systems, are also extracted from the African continent. Given that Africa is seen as the next frontier of AI development, digital resources like data, which advance the capabilities of AI, will likely become the next commodity exploited by foreign entities, fueling an era of neocolonialism. These concerns, along with issues of bias, disinformation, climate impacts, and economic inequality, elevate a need for comprehensive and harmonized AI and data regulation efforts across the African continent. This talk will examine the burgeoning AI and data governance landscape in Africa, analyzing the impact of AI in democratic processes, and also outlining best measures to democratize African participation in global AI governance. Globally, AI development is centralized in countries like the US, China, Canada, the UK, and the European Union. Despite historical barriers and present-day challenges, researchers, developers, grassroots organizations, and companies throughout the African continent have begun to make notable progress in democratizing how AI is developed, where such development takes place, and also who these technologies benefit. In many African countries, grassroots AI and machine learning communities have helped fill in access and capacity gaps of traditional AI and machine learning education and training in universities and also in tertiary learning institutions. This has helped to increase participation from communities that have been traditionally underrepresented in AI development. Grassroots organizations like Masakane and Ghana NLP develop datasets and machine translation tools to help expand access to low-resource African languages. Efforts like Deep Learning Indaba, AI Saturdays Lagos, and Data Science Africa, amongst many others, have also been instrumental in growing communities of AI researchers and developers within Africa through forming conferences, workshops, and study groups. Outside of natural language processing, specialized AI communities have also arisen, focusing on healthcare like Sisonke Biotique, and also sustainability like AfricaatKU. More recently, AI machine learning communities have also begun to rise in Francophone West Africa, with AI Hub Senegal and Khmer AI in Cameroon, and also in Northern Africa, with communities like Morocco AI, the Tunisian AI Society, and Zaire AI in Algeria. AI research labs on the continent have grown in prominence over the past decade, with many traced to the 2020 four-year $20 million Canadian dollars Artificial Intelligence for Development in Africa initiative that was funded by the Canadian International Development Agency, or Research Center, and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, also known as SIDA. Notable academic AI research labs on the continent are the AI and Data Science Research Lab at Makerere University in Uganda, the Data Science for Social Impact Lab at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and the AI and Robotics Lab at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. There's also a growing number of formal degree programs in AI machine learning, such as the African Master in Machine Intelligence, offered by the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences. There's also Masters of Science in Artificial Intelligence that's offered by the University of Mauritius, and a Bachelor of Science in Artificial Intelligence offered by Kumasi Technical University. And these are just a few of the many growing programs in AI across the continent. Over the past decade, the AI startup ecosystem within Africa has also expanded tremendously. While estimates on the number of AI startups operating within the continent vary, these estimates say they're around anywhere from 500 to 2,000 or so. Countries with these thriving tech scenes, like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, have really shown expansive growth in AI, particularly through the startup ecosystem. There's also notable activity from emerging entrants in the African AI ecosystem, which include countries like Zimbabwe, Cameroon, and Uganda. These startups are focused in a range of fields, including healthcare, language generation, and robotics, showing promise to help bridge some of the development challenges we've seen within Africa over the past couple decades. According to Startup Plus Africa, 85 AI startups on the continent have received cumulative funding of $261 million USD. And the top 10 startups in the space have commanded around $238 million, and the top 3, $207 million. InstaDeep, which is a company focusing on decision-making AI systems for biology, logistics, electrical design, and energy, is the most successful AI startup to come out of Africa. It was founded in Tunisia in 2014 and acquired by BioNTech, a German pharmaceutical company, in 2023 for $680 million. InstaDeep has more than 400 employees across the world at offices in London, Paris, Berlin, Tunis, Lagos, Cape Town, Boston, and San Francisco. Research data produced by AfriLabs, a network organization supporting innovation centers across African countries, and analyzed by TechAbout, which is a Pan-African tech publication, indicates that over 50% of African AI startups are in 7 countries. As the AI system within Africa grows, it will be essential that these services built on the continent include Africans from a diverse set of backgrounds and also regions. So now we'll get into some challenges when it comes to just thinking about how we can scale the AI ecosystem within Africa. Given the large amounts of data that is needed to train AI systems and the high number of computing resources consumed in this process, infrastructure challenges affecting African countries is a barrier to AI development in this region. Limited internet penetration within Africa can be largely attributed to infrastructure challenges, like inadequate access to electricity and also insufficient investments in critical internet infrastructure. Africa particularly struggles with internet access, and in the last decade, internet accessibility in Africa has significantly risen, increasing from an estimated 8% in 2011 to 36% in 2021, according to the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. Fortunately, plans are underway to begin improving connectivity in Africa, which is one step that is essential to ensuring that countries within the continent can equitably participate in AI research and development and also be able to access traditional digital services. To Africa, which is the longest subsea internet cable ever designed, is currently under deployment and has 46 connections to land-based networks across 33 countries within Africa, Asia, and Europe. According to the World Bank, out of all world regions, Sub-Saharan Africa also has the lowest percentage of citizens that are equipped with digital skills. This equals about to half of the average level of global digital skills adoption. Thus, to ensure that AI is accessible to broader non-technical populations in Africa, there's a need to distill these topics for various audiences and also develop culturally relevant content. Additionally, African countries rank low in their respective concentration and production of AI talent. These numbers rapidly diminish when considering the concentration of top-tier researchers who are considered to be researchers that published at prominent AI conferences. And so these researchers are also primarily situated within the US and China. However, a research published in the Harvard Business Review shows that Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Lagos are quickly becoming AI talent hotspots within the continent. Along with investing in cloud computing infrastructure, governments in Africa must also build the capacity to train local researchers and developers to help expand their respective AI ecosystems. However, given unstable political environments and economies in some regions of Africa, these efforts could be hampered if brain drain continues to increase. The 2020 Africa Developer Ecosystem Report by Google estimates that about 38% of African developers work in Africa countries for the company that has its headquarters based outside of the continent. This trend could potentially follow for AI jobs if there's not sufficient investment in training and also retaining this talent. Over the past year, the African AI governance space has expanded dramatically with nation-specific efforts from countries like Nigeria and Benin, and also continental-wide efforts from the African Union. The Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs defines AI governance as a set of rules, regulations, ethical and technical frameworks, and similar mechanisms that guide the development and deployment of AI technologies. Given the fundamental role of data in training machine learning models, evaluating AI systems, and refining these predictive models, there's also much effort needed to enact effective data governance to ensure that we have sufficient protections around AI governance. The increasing development and adoption of AI has dramatically shifted practices around data, spurring the development of new industries and revealing new forms of exploitation. These new complexities around data production, refinement, and use have also impacted African countries, elevating a need for more comprehensive governance and enforcement measures. About 36 out of 55 African Union member states, which includes the disputed territory of the Sahrawi Arab Republic or Western Sahara, have enacted formal data protection regulations. Along with country-specific data governance regulations, regional economic communities and entities like the African Union have also introduced data protection acts. The Malabo Convention, also known as the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, was ratified in June 2023, 9 years after its adoption. There's also been lots of regional efforts towards data protection that have been implemented by organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, also known as ECOWAS, the Southern African Development Community, and the East African Community. However, there has not been any regional governance measures proposed by the Arab Maghreb Union, the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, or the Economic Community of Central African States. And at the moment, when we think about AI, only 25 out of 55 African Union member states have a policy, strategy, plan, or guideline on AI, according to the African Observatory on AI. This also includes either a ministerial or presidential statement or a fully developed strategy document like that of Mauritius. Countries like Benin, Egypt, Mauritius, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal have developed national AI strategies, but Rwanda is the only country in Africa that has introduced a formal AI policy. However, it's yet to be fully enacted. There's also been promising efforts to govern AI in Africa, particularly through the African Union Continental AI Strategy, which I was involved in the drafting efforts over the past 2.5 years. This strategy provides guidance for African countries to harness AI to meet Africa's development aspirations and also the well-being of its people while promoting ethical use, minimizing potential risk, and also leveraging opportunities. So now I'll go into the later part of the conversation or presentation to talk about some AI policy opportunities for Africa and how I envision, our global participation in this AI governance conversation. While the purported benefits of AI have promised to help African countries fast-track development and reach the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, these technologies come with many risks, some of which have already been realized in African countries. Recent coverage has highlighted the harms data annotators and content moderators in Kenya have faced when repeatedly exposed to graphic content in their work. As countries within Africa build their respective capacity for AI development, and Western companies increase their reliance on Africa for novel sources of data, there are concerns that this exploitation could continue or even worsen. Additionally, the lack of robust data protection and AI policies throughout the continent could potentially lead to greater levels of misuse as AI grows in reach. While African countries are not the only countries, lacking AI legislation, African countries must make a concerted effort to draft AI strategies and also move towards implementing them to protect vulnerable communities and also to enable and promote responsible innovation. Generative AI also has a strong potential and is already being seen in impacting democratic processes, primarily in elections. Within African countries, elections are often plagued by high rates of disinformation, social unrest, internet blackouts, and ballot tampering. This increases the increasing ubiquity of generative AI heightens concerns that AI-fueled disinformation campaigns could exacerbate current issues affecting democratic processes throughout Africa. And while current development priorities like refining social services, tackling insecurity, and planning for climate change are higher priorities than AI in many contexts, African countries still must concurrently work towards developing robust data and AI regulation. Some of my recent work also shows that African countries face a range of difficulties in meeting their technological potential. This includes weak or insufficient data protection regimes, complications in achieving robust oversight frameworks, and also a limited governance and economic resources to devote to technological and also workforce development. To help address AI concerns and accelerate efforts towards effectively regulating AI, African governments must harness the capabilities of their digital ministries to support the development of data and AI legislation. Over the past year, African ICT ministers, information communication technologies, have increasingly become influential in global conversations on AI governance. And as of 2023, nearly every African country has a digital ministry, which provides a sufficient base to develop and eventually implement AI legislation. However, African governments must intentionally invest into their digital ministries, along with building local AI talent and relying on the diaspora, in many cases like Nigeria has done, to help address these technical challenges and develop novel governance solutions. As African countries grapple with the potential benefits of AI, cautious approaches to building, implementing, and governing these technologies are needed. AI should not be seen as a band-aid or a panacea for solving development issues. There should be equitable investment by countries towards building capacity for traditional social services, while also making efforts towards building sustainable AI ecosystems. So this is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to talk more at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kolo, for an amazing presentation. So we're going to go to the next speaker now. Dr. Samuel Shegun, we're ready for you. I would send you a message when you have 5 minutes left on your time. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I'll be talking briefly about shaping the ethics of AI through African values, and my approach here is to do a little bit of philosophical conversation. I'll have a little bit of philosophical conversation about this. I saw the background of the host, and I figured that talking a bit about it from a philosophical perspective might be quite insightful. Over the last 2.5 years, I've been doing some research around African values, particularly how that might shape developing policies that are unique or context-driven. So that'll be part of what I'll be discussing here. And part of my research focuses on doing work around AI system evaluation and audits. And so what I try to do here is to look for a very practical ways that we could talk about AI ethics from an African place and still embodying some of the values or the context that is driving the conversation on the continent. So why does this matter? First of all, that we know that AI brings enormous economic value to Africans and to Africa as a continent. And a recent research by AI4D shows that there's a likelihood that the continent will experience about almost $3 billion or $3 trillion in value from having artificial intelligence in different aspects, like running things like logistics, healthcare, education, and the like. Also, there's a need to talk about the cultural relevance of the ethical frameworks that inform some of the AI policies that we are having. In Euro-America, the conversation seem to be driven a lot around data governance, and for the right reasons. In much of Africa, it seems to be driven by the need to talk about how to establish, first of all, the infrastructure, as Dr. Okolo has mentioned, and also to talk about how it could be used for social good, largely because of the peculiar state the continent finds itself. And also there's a lack of discourse as to how the impact of AI on the value systems that we hold there as Africans could be. And so one of the reasons why it matters is to talk about, the impact on African ethical values. And also this issue of the idea that corporate motivations are at odds with ethical values in most cases, while corporations are driven by the need to make profit. Ethics or the ethical values that people hold usually is to try to regulate that drive. And usually that would mean that corporations might be more incentivized to cut corners, or might be incentivized to be first to market or to get a first mover advantage. Whereas ethics would, in most cases, would require us to be a bit more cautious about it. So for the context of this talk, I've defined African ethics as, or what I refer to as African ethics here, as some sort of like salient ethical values or salient moral principles that are representative of collectivist worldview that is held or upheld by a significant number of people from sub-Saharan Africa. And I arrived at this definition largely because much of the work around African ethics centers around the value systems you'll find in English-speaking sub-Saharan Africa. So the ones you'd find in East Africa, you find in Southern Africa, you find in West Africa. So for instance, in Southern Africa, many of us know this is referred to as Ubuntu. In East Africa, it's Ujamaa. It's a Swahili word, getting from the Tanzanian former president, Julius Nyerere. And then in West Africa, we've got like several names for them, likely because there are quite a number of cultures. The Igbo one, which is Igbo and Idanda, which is a sense of complementarity. But in all, they sort of speak about the same thing. The other point I wanted to make here is that African ethical values align in the sense that it aligns with the classical ethical values or ethical principles as you find in Western philosophy, things like virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. So depending on the conception of African ethical value that you hold, you get to see a bit of virtue ethics in it, especially when we talk about things like personhood, becoming a person. Then that's building moral character in that sense. And then you talk about utilitarianism when we talk about promoting communal well-being or talking about the common good, which is a version of utilitarianism. And then we also have deontology when we talk about rights, duties. Okay, so there are quite a few recurring themes, and I'll just run through a few of them. Might have a bit more conversation about this later. One of which is the concept of community and interdependence as opposed to independence, which is very predominant in Western philosophical thoughts. And you'd find the idea of community expressed very differently in collectivist culture. You find that in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. You find that as well in Africa and Latin America as well, that communities that uphold the sense of interdependence. And this could be, there are several ways you could argue that the sense of community is grounded. And in African philosophical thoughts, it's grounded in the sense of relationship. In some sense, it's grounded in the idea of vitality. It's grounded in, there's several ways to just look at it. And we'll talk about this briefly later. Also, there's also the idea of the collective well-being, or what is referred to as like the pursuit for the common good, as opposed to a very utilitarian way of looking at things from the position of a greater good. Then we also have the concept of rights versus duties. So in a sense, much of what you find in African philosophical thoughts places obligation on the individual to contribute to the well-being of society in that sense. Whereas if you look at it in Western philosophical thoughts, it's usually influenced by the sense of pursuing some idea of rightness of an action. So actions that are set to the right if they meet certain, like threshold of morality or something, which is quite different from what you would see in many African philosophical thoughts. This is just a very high-level conversation around it, not in-depth. There are certain nuances that are attached to this, but for the purpose of this work, I'm just trying to make it as simple as possible. Also, there's the idea of harmony and consensus versus majoritarianism. So it's believed that's the kind of democracy that was practiced in traditional African thoughts, where built on the concept of consensus. So if we want to arrive at a decision, we arrive at a consensus. It's not really that the majority carries the vote for the day. And also there's a strong emphasis on relationship, because how does relationship matter? It matters because part of you becoming a member of the community is to build relationship, camaraderie, and friendship with other people. And so that sense of fellowship with other people is considered central in African philosophical thought. And also there's the concept of human dignity, which is grounded in the sense of respect for elders, respect for the other person, and also reciprocity. And there's usually the conversation around moral personhood versus rational personhood. And this usually is coming from conversations around Kantianism, that's Immanuel Kant's idea of what a rational person should be, and his idea that a moral agent is one that has to be rational, as opposed to in African philosophical thought, where the thinking is that a moral person need not really be rational in that sense. And we pursue moral personhood, not necessarily rational personhood. And so one of the critiques Immanuel Kant has always had to his work has been that the question of what happens to a person who is in a vegetative state, they do not possess the capacity to be rational. And does that mean they do not qualify as persons? Whereas in the African philosophical sense, the argument is usually once a person has the capacity to commune or be communed with, they qualify to fall under some sort of moral circle. That's a very long debate that we can get into now. There's also the idea of avoidance of harm, or at least minimization of harm. And this is also central to many of the conversation around African philosophical thought, and in some sense plays into the idea of utilitarianism. Also, there's a concept of duty and responsibility and reciprocity. So resource sharing, which is also very central to some of the idea around building an AI ecosystem in Africa, especially the need to build it as open source, which if we follow some of these values, that will be central to. So another part of it is with resource sharing also comes a sense of egalitarianism, that everyone should have access to resources and it should be distributed fairly and evenly. Okay. So I just look at select African principles. I chose 3 and to just talk about how this sort of informs the development of AI systems. Afro-communitarianism, which is rooted in the idea of relationships and the community. The goal is to prioritize communal relationships and interdependence. And the idea is that you realize some sort of selfhood through the community. You cannot do this alone. It's not through being an independent person per se. You have to do this through the community. The other is also the primacy of relationships over individualism. So like I would point out in my later slide, some of the focus of the current AI systems is just focused on the individuals and how can they optimize for the individuals, as opposed to looking at it a lot more holistically when you look at it from an African philosophical and ethical perspective. And also the concept of human dignity, which is grounded in the normative conception of personhood. I'm sure we've heard several versions of that said, one of which is how we talk about Ubuntu I am because we are, where the goal is to become more of yourself by being a part of the community. So a person is said to have dignity in the sense that they have the capacity to be subject to an object of a communal relationship, or they possess some sort of like vital force. And the idea of vital force here is that there is something that is unique. There's a force, an energy that is unique to humans that make them different from other life forms. And this is just one conception of how vital force is used. And vital force helps us and makes it possible for us to commune with other people and to also accord them dignity. And I'll explain to you why this conception is kind of important when we start to talk about things like facial recognition technology and the like. Also because of the idea of how dignity, or the role dignity plays in terms of our capacity to commune with others, and because we possess vital force, it becomes central to conversations around human rights in African philosophical thoughts and even legal systems. There's also the concept of the common good. So the notion of the common good, as opposed to the greatest good. The common good focuses on the well-being and flourishing of the entire community, which could mean that it's also the greatest good in a sense, whereas the pursuing the greatest good in a strictly utilitarian sense might not necessarily imply the common good or the flourishing of everyone. And it also like focuses on equitable distribution of social benefits for individuals and the community as a whole. So like I mentioned there, utilitarianism focuses on maximizing things like happiness or pleasure or benefits, even if it requires sacrificing the rights and welfare of a minority to achieve this. Whereas with the common good, it looks at taking everyone along. Okay, so what are the challenges with the current AI models in the context of African ethics? If we look at it this way, one of them is the individualism as opposed to Afro-communitarianism. So, many of the current AI models that are built usually to optimize for individual user experience. And at the end, this sort of subverts communal benefits. So an example would be like the spread of AI-generated misinformation that fuels discord and exacerbates conflict on the continent, for instance. An example being the conflict in Ethiopia with the Tigray region. Facebook is used, and Facebook algorithm tend to amplify a sort of discord because it would drive engagement. And remember that the goal there is to optimize the experience for the individual. So if an individual chooses or watches a video not necessarily agreeing with that video, they get to see more of that and it fuels more hate. And knowing that the sense of community is founded on being able to fellowship with other and with others, and the pursuit for that sort of harmony and not discord. This sort of runs at odds with that idea. There's also the challenge of like building AI models to optimize for individuals. I worked as a product manager with an AI company where we built credit card or credit rating systems. And one of the models we built was just focused on optimizing the experience for the user. And I thought about that purely from an African perspective. So from an African perspective, or many African society, there's the idea of contributing or what's called like communal savings or rotational savings groups, where a group of people come together, put some of their earnings together to save. If you think about how credit rating works, it's optimized for the individuals, not optimized for supporting like community-style savings, community-style financial inclusion. And in a sense, when you think about how we build AI models, we often build AI models with the individual first, which those have argued, those from collectivist cultures view this as purely Western way of thinking of the world. So it's an individualistic way of thinking of the world, as opposed to an Afro-communitarian way of thinking of it, in the sense that we are building systems that optimize for the individual as opposed to optimize for the community. Also, there's would I say, sometimes a conscious or subconscious decentering of human rights. I'm glad that some of the conversations around building policies around the continent is centered on reinforcing the idea that human rights should be central to the development of AI technologies. Decentering in human rights, we see this in several ways. One of them is, AI systems often reducing the complex human identity and experience into simplified data points, potentially overlooking nuances. So if you look at facial recognition technology and the impact it's had, for instance, if you look at even things like recommendation systems and how recommendation systems are used in advertising, even advertising things like gambling platforms, and even targeting people who are susceptible to or who are impressionable to that, or people with addiction who have to struggle to overcome this addiction to gambling. And these AI systems or these recommendation systems are not built with the idea to sort of emphasize the need to like consider the person first, consider that humans. They just see every interaction of every person there as data points, no sense of understand the complex identity that makes up the person. Also, there's an increasing reliance on AI, which also sort of distances the interaction between humans in that sense, and sort of distance the way we view people first as humans before we look at them as purely data points. Examples of how AI has been used in lending, AI is used in the criminal justice system, or it's used in employment. I'm sure some of us are familiar with the ProPublica article on the correctional offender management profiling and alternative sanction system, the one called Compass, that actually predicted or was used to design to predict recidivism rates, and would identify the wrong person, and most times minority group, people from minority groups, and particularly people of African-American descent, sometimes predicting that they're more likely to commit more crimes than people of other races. And unfortunately, in cases where that was reviewed, it was the opposite. The people of other races committed more crimes, even though they got shorter sentences than them. We also have a case of Facebook, where Facebook algorithm that was meant to detect misinformation on the platform ended up being a platform to subvert like campaigns for civil rights in Nigeria during the EndSARS police brutality protest. And what that shows is that an algorithm designed in a particular context outside of the African context might have some difficulty being able to solve problems on the continent. I'll just quickly run through these. It's also most of the African philosophical thoughts are grounded on the idea of building relationships and community and building trust. Much of the AI systems as we see today are quite exploitative in the sense that they are focused more on surveillance as opposed to trust building. In a minute and a half, I'll just quickly run through how I think that we can shape AI development through African values. One of which would be applying, AI or using indigenous knowledge systems to be able to build AI systems. A good example is the Hausa NLP research being done. Hausa is about the second largest spoken language on the continent of Africa. And they recently discovered that there are certain texts that were written way back pre-colonial times that contains extensive work done in physics and chemistry, in health sciences, and this is stored in the libraries of the emirs and the Sultan of Sokoto. And the team at the Outside NLP Group Research is trying to build some LLMs to be able to translate some of those works and also make them available to the public and to solve problems using indigenous knowledge because they are quite unique to the environment. This could include things like also prediction, precision agriculture that is used because much of the land is currently experiencing deforestation, and there are historical records that showed that this had been tackled in the past. And so it's important to prioritize things like indigenous knowledge because they contain in them the sense of the principles of sustainability, the principles of egalitarianism and resource sharing. There's also the traditional water management system used by the Dongo tribe in Mali. They have sort of Edmonds, stone bonds, earth basins, and ways to conserve water in very arid lands. And I think that these are quite important things we could look at that are centered on the value of distribution, proper egalitarian distribution of resources, and ensuring that power is not concentrated in one place. Also, because the other ways I thought about doing this is that we talk about open source initiatives. And one of the good things that the NLP team at the University of Pretoria is doing is to make sure that some of the models they build is actually made open source so that we can drive social good. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Sanwoolu. So we're going to move on to the last speaker now. Dr. Tanya, over to you. I'll send you a message when you have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Apologies, let me just move back. All right. So firstly, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. And thank you to my two fellow speakers for their presentations. It's very interesting. And I think there are some interesting points of overlap also, or perhaps not overlap, but where we kind of pick up on the same kinds of themes. So I'm going to try and highlight those a little bit. So my presentation is partly focused on kind of the rollout of AI, broadly speaking, in Africa, but it's not only limited to the African context. So I think some of the concerns that I have are much broader than the African context, but I think they are exacerbated in the African context for many of the reasons that have been mentioned by the previous speakers. So there was reference already to this document by Dr. Okolo, and I start with it to highlight the tremendous hope I think that often comes with the implementation or at least the promise of implementing various AI technologies in various sectors. And that is, as she also put it, that artificial intelligence is going to help Africans in general meet many of the developmental challenges that the continent faces. And it's often packaged in that way as well. And there is space for that hope. I think there is reason to be optimistic about some of the claims that are made with regard to that there are to be had from implementing artificial intelligence in various sectors. But I think sometimes there's a danger that we might get of hype. And there are various drivers to the AI hype. Dr. Segun mentioned, corporate motivations. Of course, there are corporate motivations to drive the hype, and I also think it also often has to do with a lot of hope. So I refer to I refer to this article by Abeba Bahrain, where she describes being in a conference on the benefits of AI, or at least the potential benefits of various AI technologies. And she describes how most of the participants in that conference were what she called techno-optimists. So the assumption is primarily that AI systems can do what they are advertised as being able to do, right? And so there's kind of a tremendous hope that some of these benefits could also flow to Africa. There's awareness of the limitations. When we've already had some of them mentioned, or possible obstacles, things like lack of relevant data and lack of compute. But there are very few, at least in the circles that I'm moving in at the moment, very few critical voices about some of the promises that are made on the basis of or at least by some of the proponents of AI technologies. And it's something that I'm worried about, because there are all sorts of ethical risks, as we are all aware. And these risks, I think, are often exacerbated in the African context, partly due to facts like the lack of relevant data and so on, but also I think due to the fact that a lot of the continent is resource constrained and or constrained, and we cannot necessarily afford investing in technologies that end up not doing what they are advertised or at least presented as being able to do. I can mention an example, like in my own context later on during the discussion, if you're at all interested. All right, so and she pushes back a little bit. So she pushes back a little bit against the techno-optimism, and I think she's right to do that, and I want to do that as well. But I want to kind of take a slightly different take than she does. So as far as I can tell about in terms of the work of Dr. Bahrain, her critique is often aimed at generative AI and the capabilities of generative AI. I actually want to bring the conversation back to what we can call predictive AI as well. So I'll make that distinction in a moment. All right, so what, as she describes it, is sometimes or traditionally the conversation was something like, well, all right, all that Africa needs is data and AI, right? And when we've got these two things, then we can meet various developmental challenges, along with a lot of awareness that has come. The conference that she was referring to happened in 2019. So in the meantime, I think there's a lot more awareness of some of the ethical concerns and challenges that potentially arise in implementing these technologies. And so there's definitely greater awareness that things like the necessary governance regimes are in place. There's reference to data management and so on. But I still think there's a little bit more room for a critical lens to be kind of put, or a critical focus to be put on some of the promises that are made with regard to what implementing these technologies in various contexts, and contexts that are usually mentioned are people-facing contexts that are high
Dr. Tanya is experiencing some network glitch.
Okay, I think we're just gonna wait for about 30 seconds or 1 minute, and if she isn't back, we can just proceed with questions.
Or is it just basically there is no action at all in those countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't want to say there's, no action in the other countries. I think that sometimes it could be hard to measure because a lot of these analyses rely on databases like Crunchbase or other like startup databases. And if companies don't necessarily register their activities, then it's hard to find them. Also, like if they don't make a LinkedIn page or don't necessarily explicitly say that they're an AI company or they're working in AI, then it can also be hard to measure. And so that's a challenge I've also experienced in my respective analyses as well. And I think it's also interesting that you mentioned these countries or like premier AI countries or in Africa being along the coast. I think this also just has to deal, with internet connectivity also being a bit easier as you think about the infrastructure that's aligned with how internet cables are installed in generally. And so I know there's for example, there's been some recent efforts and I believe Malawi has actually formed partnerships with countries on the coast like Mozambique and other like East African countries to actually have them filter internet through them. And so I think this will have a big impact in terms of how they are able to, one, just access the internet in general, but also to, I would say, participate in the AI ecosystem. And so I see that Dr. Tanya is back. And so I'll say my last point very briefly, but when it comes to AI development, I think we're still seeing startups emerge a bit gradually. A lot of the development I reference in my work has been by these grassroots communities of AI researchers. And so they may be affiliated with academic institutions, but the companies are, the organizations are not necessarily I would say for profit. And so there's a lot of, I would say pro bono or, nonprofit AI work going on. And so I think there's a strong potential for a lot of this to transfer or develop into for-profit organizations, like Lelapa AI, for example, which a lot of the founders that were involved in Masakane and Dupani and Daba, actually founded that startup organization. And so I see similar trends following throughout the continent.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Okolo. Okay. Dr. Tanya, do you want to continue from now? Hello, Dr. Tanya.
I have to apologize. I'm very sorry about that. So, yeah, we had a problem with the Wi-Fi, and of course now, just when I want to start my presentation again, there we go. All right, so I really want to apologize. I don't want to take up too much of the discussion time. So please stop me if you would like to go into discussion time rather than me going through the entire presentation. I'm going to kind of try and condense it a little bit, and then maybe we can pick up on some of the issues in the discussion time, if that's all right with you. Okay, so what I was going to say was in the ethics literature in general, the ethics literature in general, I think there's a lot of focus on specific kinds of ethics issues that arise in the context of developing, rolling out and using various kinds of AI-based technologies. But I think there is perhaps more room to be slightly skeptical about some of the claims that are made in terms of what these systems can do. And perhaps surprisingly, I'm drawing on some of the critique that has been coming from kind of the computer scientists themselves, right? So kind of that's been coming out of the academic work that has been done by some people who are involved in creating these systems in the first place. So yeah, you might be aware of this book that has come out recently, AI Snake Oil, which is based on work done by the two authors, Narayanan and Kapoor, that work that they've been doing for a while now. So it's a popular book, but based on kind of the academic work that they've been doing. And there's kind of a long line of researchers that have been pointing out that perhaps we should be slightly more critical of some of the claims that are made with regard to what these systems can do, or at least critical in terms of how they are deployed, what they're used for, what they're applied for. Right, I'm not going to say much about what I mean with AI, but I just want to, I think this distinction is going to help a little bit. So recently, a lot of people in this kind of space have been distinguishing between what can be called predictive AI. So systems, the more traditional kind of AI systems. So with more traditional, I mean, not your generative AI, so not your large language model or diffusion model based kind of systems, but your more traditional systems where you have machine learning being used to learn patterns from data, and that is used to automate certain decisions. And often the systems are used to replace human decision-making, right? So the systems are implemented in a space where a person would have made a decision in the past. So some examples that we might refer to in that regard is a system that is used to predict health risk, the health risk of patients. So that could be used to triage patients in a healthcare setting, for example. A system that is used to determine, to try to determine future success in a university, for example, so for applicants, or a system that is used, for example, to assess the suitability of candidates for a given job, right? So that's what I mean when I refer to predictive AI, right? So this work that I refer to by Narayanan and Kapoor and many of their colleagues, they often focus on critiquing a predictive AI. And as I said before, Dr. Birain kind of critiques generative AI. As far as I can tell, that's more her focus. And I think there's interesting cross-pollination that can happen there. I think many of the critiques to both kinds of systems kind of, or the critiques that are leveraged by these theorists on both kinds of systems kind of can apply to the others as well. Right. So let's just talk about some of the reasons to perhaps be a little bit skeptical, or at least cautious with regard to some of the AI, some of the functions or tasks that the AI systems are employed to fulfill. So this article by Raji et al. Is one of the articles that I showed in an earlier slide. They basically synthesize the problems that they identify as often these systems are constructed haphazardly, deployed indiscriminately, and promoted deceptively, right? And there are various ethical concerns that arise with all three kind of these problems with these systems. And I think they're all exacerbated often in the African context, where because of developmental challenges, I think, and lack of kind of resources, the potential negative implications of all three of these kind of problematic aspects of the way in which these systems are presented, I think are exacerbated. Right? So I think the kind of problems are often worse, or could potentially be worse in the African context. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to run through their very useful taxonomy of AI failure. If you are at all interested, I refer you to the paper. They basically give a kind of breakdown of the ways in which AI systems end up not working as they are meant to work, right? So basically, it doesn't do what it says on the tin, right? Often, I think our ethics discussions and our governance discussions focus on what they would characterize as engineering failures and post-deployment failures, right? So where there's a problem in terms of how the system is conceptualized, there's a problem, I'm going to come back to that slide, perhaps in terms of the variables that are chosen, what it is that we are going to accept as an acceptable failure rate for the system, or an acceptable kind of rate of true positive, false positive or false negatives, or whatever it is that that we want the system to be doing. How to process the training data, choice of training data, right? All of these are problems that we often discuss in terms of the ethics of deploying these systems. And the idea often seems to be, well, if we address these in engineering failures, right? These potential ways in which system design can go wrong, or if we address the post-deployment failures, right, where the system is used on the other side in a way that isn't anticipated, and that leads to kind of negative ethical effects downstream. If we address these, then these systems are going to do, what we're employing them to do. But something that I'm finding very interesting from a philosophical perspective is what they call impossible tasks, and then from an ethical perspective, what they call communication failures, which I will get to. All right, and this is something that Narayan and Kapoor pick up on, that I just also want to address a little bit later. So with regard to impossible tasks, what G and L have in mind is they say that sometimes the systems are put to a use that they just cannot do, right? So the task that they are assigned, that they are employed to fulfill, are impossible tasks, right? And there are two ways in which they conceive of tasks as impossible tasks. So firstly, conceptually, right? So they use as an example here, the recent very controversial claims within the literature, for example, that you can determine, you can use machine learning to determine people's sexual orientation by with reference to their physical characteristics, right? So their physical appearance, or claims in the similar vein that you can determine criminality from physical appearance using machine learning, right? So obviously that's an impossible task. Why is it impossible? Conceptually, there's no relation between the two, right? Between your kind of physiological appearance and whether or not you are a criminal, or your sexual orientation or whatever, right? So, and that's fairly uncontroversial, right? So those are fairly uncontroversial impossible tasks, and no one really takes that kind of, well, that's an exaggeration. Very, very few people take those kinds of claims very seriously. There are some that do. But for me, what is more interesting is what they call practical impossibility, right? And so some tasks that these systems are put to are impossible given practical constraints, but it's not obvious that these practical constraints can be overcome. So an example that they mention, which I think is very salient and relevant, is some of the constraints faced by IBM's Watson in trying to kind of leverage the system to be a support in cancer diagnosis. And I mean, these attempts to do that were eventually abandoned, and the reason for that had a lot to do partly with kind of the data that was available. So you would have data that is kind of distributed through clinicians' notes and so on, and getting this data in a kind of machine readable format and a consistent format, and all of those things were extremely there were extreme practical constraints in order to be able to do that. All right, I will try to round up. Thank you for your message. So, and the point that they're trying to make there is sometimes these practical constraints are such that the task is going to be impossible, even if it's not conceptually impossible, right? and they have a focus on various predictive AI systems in that regard. So jumping over a bit of content, I just want to kind of tie that to Narayanan and Kapoor's very strong, I think, case against what they call predictive optimization. So I'm not going to go into the details of what their case is, but basically what they are concerned with are the kinds of systems that are used to make decisions on social outcomes. Sorry, I'm just looking for the definition. So where machine learning is used, so it's a very specific kind of predictive AI. They're not critical about all kinds of AI, but where you make use of machine learning, right? So you're training a model to make predictions about some future outcome about that pertains to individuals, and especially about future outcome that is socially weighty. So healthcare outcomes, job prospect outcomes, those kinds of outcomes, whether or not you're committing welfare fraud or whether the recidivism case that Samuel referred to, and then make decisions on that basis. All right. So when the system itself is making the decision, so you're going to be flagged for welfare fraud, or you are going to be admitted to the university or not, whatever the case may be. And they argue that predictive optimization fails on its own terms. So it claims, the claims that are often made about these kinds of systems is the advantages to implementing them is that there is a high accuracy, that they will allow for fairness across demographic groups if designed correctly, and that there are efficiency gains, right? So that there's kind of a financial gain, or at least a kind of net positive in terms of implementing these systems that justifies implementing them in a space where there are research constraints. And for reasons that I'm not going to go into, they argue that it fails in these terms, right? These systems are not necessarily highly accurate or fair. And a lot of the times, the amount of money and resources that is going to be required to make them accurate and fair is going to erode the efficiency gains. And in some cases, you're not necessarily going to get to the accuracy and fairness in any case, right? And I'm not going to go into details for why they say that. I just want to highlight that they end up arguing that predictive optimization should be considered as presumptively illegitimate unless proven otherwise, right? So their claim isn't that we should never employ these kinds of systems, that we should never invest in them or implement them, but their claim is that we should treat them as presumptively illegitimate and put the burden of proof on the corporation or the entity that is providing the system to prove that they are not harmful, right? To prove that very, very many of these ethical risks that we know come with these systems do not apply, right? So basically prove non-harmfulness. All right. And for various reasons, I think that the critiques that they leverage at predictive AI systems and large language model, generative AI, are even more salient in the African context. I'm going to stop there. I apologize through the rush through the presentation. Maybe we can pick up on some talking points during the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tanya. It's no worry at all. We fully understand, and we really enjoyed your presentation. I think we can now go into the question and answer. We are running really fast out of time. So I think Shegun left a question for Dr. Shegun. So it says, how can our sense of community influence our approaches to AI? Since AI systems usually focus on the individual, in what way can we build or use AI systems that recognize the sense of community?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I want to preface that by saying, so AI systems do not exist in a vacuum. People build them, and the people that build them sometimes tend to superimpose their perception of the world on those systems. There's usually this argument around dichotomization of ideas that is quite prevalent in Western thoughts. That's usually, I think the first person who raised that was Jacques Derrida, pointed out that there's just this penchant and tendency to always see things as binaries. It's true or false. It's you're conservative or liberal. There's no room for the middle ground. And usually when people build systems like that, it tends to be that we think it's an either or kind of situation. And so the point I'm trying to make with that is that the people who build them, if they're influenced by that system of thinking, it tends to, you see that in the system. One way to build a system that's reflective of communities to shift the focus to collective outcome rather than have individualistic outcome. The example I gave you with credit modeling, for instance, that is focused and optimized for the individual and the individual's credit experience, which obviously cannot be transferred. If we shift that focus to focus on things like community savings that is common amongst people of Africa, then the building that kind of model will be totally different. The other is to encourage the diversity of team diversity. There's a tendency to view things, and as someone who's worked with development teams on this, they view things from particular way. If you have your team purely made up of people with engineering background, chances are they see things as engineers. And so you want to make sure you have a diverse team. You also want to have a diverse data set. The goal is to ensure that one data set does not have an overweight on the prediction that is to be made. Then another way to do that is I talked about open source, building AI systems for social good. I'm glad Hugging Face is available. There are over 400,000 models, different types. So we need to encourage more stuff about open source, sharing information that might be valuable to people in general.
Thank you so much for sharing. So does anyone have any? Okay, Professor Opokodu has a question, so we can take your question, Professor Opokodu. Professor Opokodu, you are muted.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Professor Opokodu.
Okay, yeah. Thank you all. I like this forward-looking symposium, and the presentations have been very good. Sorry I didn't, I came in late. But my question is, are you looking at this from the entire view of the African continent in terms of the African Union? Has the African Union made any pronouncements or policies on AI?
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Opokodu. So I think Dr. Okolo might be in the really good position to answer that question because she has done fantastic work with the African Union. So Dr. Okolo, if you could answer that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I believe all the speakers have been involved in this process in some way, I believe. And so, but yeah, so this is the African Union AI Continental Strategy. And so it's basically a framework that aims to help, I would say, set the tone for how African countries should regulate AI, but also govern its respective development and implementation. And so I believe it's expected to be presented and potentially adopted at the AU Heads of State meeting that happens in January, February each year. And so we'll see how it goes from there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okolo. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yes.
Oh.
The individual countries, what are they doing? Because first of all, I like this symposium really, because certainly the West is going to be putting the technology and all these things on Africa. And when we're looking at Africa in terms of what Ademazuri calls the triple heritage, we cannot escape that, even though we try as much as possible to aspire towards African values. We cannot run away from the fact that in this global world, we are going to be meeting the impact of AI, either as borrowed technology, because I'm not so sure how advanced we are right now in terms of creating the data and the technology to generate our own, when I say our own, Africa's own AI. So it seems then that what I'm really asking as a follow-up is, what ethical values would Africa be following in response to borrowed technology? Don't forget that Africa is behind in developing technology, and most of the things that we have there have been borrowed from the West.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Segun, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think the answer is quite simple. There's a need to contextualize the technology, and that's the kind of conversation we are currently having. Our context is different. The example I shared with the Facebook algorithm that detects misinformation and disinformation. When people were posting events that were happening in real time, it flagged them as disinformation and blocked those accounts, which meant that the world couldn't hear what was currently going on in those protests in Nigeria. But if it was localized, if context was appropriately used to develop that model as used in that context, we'll be able to know that, okay, this is not disinformation. That algorithm was built specifically because they were targeting misinformation or disinformation as used during US elections. So I guess the answer is we need to contextualize AI, even if we bring a models from any country where it's built in China or the US or in Europe. You want to make sure that you contextualize it appropriately for use within your community or within the continent.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sheikh. So I think we can take other questions. Timothy?
Thank you. Thank you to all the presenters. I really enjoy the presentations. I'm interested in the impact of AI on work in Africa from the standpoint of psychology of the worker. We have seen that in the West, and especially in the United States, AI is said to be, quote unquote, taking people's jobs. And even in the West, we know that unemployment is not that much of a big deal as compared to the situation in Africa. So if in the West, in the United States, we already have seen complaints about how AI is replacing workers and all that. What are your thoughts on how AI is impacting work and employment in Africa? And this could be for any of the presenters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So who wants to answer the question?
I could maybe say a few things. I'm not an expert on the subject, but I think there is a risk, especially kind of in the short term, that you're going to see an increase in a lot of gig work in kind of unstable work situations. I think you already see it, that different kinds of AI technologies enable kind of the move towards a more casualized workforce, and with kind of all of the uncertainties that come with that. Dr. Okolo mentioned the work done by the data annotators and similar work that was done in the Kenyan context. So I think there's kind of a lot of work that is done by the workforce already in the global South and Africa specifically in support of development of these systems that are being developed for the West and in the Western context. So in that example of the Kenyan workers, I mean, they had a horrible work to do in terms of ChatGPT and kind of identifying and flagging the worst kind of content so that the system knows not to present this kind of content, or even to ensure that that kind of content doesn't go into the system. So I think it is already the case that there are various aspects of work on the African continent that are negatively affected, and it's not only by the systems that are being developed and deployed in a local context. It's often the systems that are being developed and deployed for a kind of global north audience. You kind of already have a lot of the kind of really hard but not terribly exciting and not terribly gratifying and not terribly lucrative data annotation work, for example, being done by workers in the global south.
Hey, thanks,
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
Response. I think there was one other person that had their hands raised.
Yes, that would be me, Korede, James Nico.
Okay.
So just to, thank every speaker. It's been a great session, and I've learned quite a lot. I think contextualizing technology is important, and developing regulatory frameworks. All of these are very much necessary. I wonder, though, to what extent do we talk about the importance of building digital infrastructures on the continent? In a way, I'm rearticulating Professor Kodo's question. I think we're thinking along the same lines, just to ask if there's a political, economic angle to all of this, and to get us to think about what it means to not constantly react to global north infrastructures in Africa, and to think about, as part of contextualizing, and localizing technologies, not from an outside perspective, but actually thinking of our own, platforms and infrastructure. So I'm asking, to what extent are we thinking about, and this may be a bit above our heads. It's not in our place to ask. We don't have the power to get government to do anything, but should we be asking those kind of questions? Should we be asking African governments to actually build these digital infrastructures such that we don't always have to react to what others are doing in the global north? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Yaku, for the great question.
Yeah, I would say that it is important for, African countries definitely to lead these efforts. There's honestly been a lot of external investment by, these multilateral finance institutions like the World Bank, for example, and particularly Nigeria, in terms of helping develop this internet infrastructure, and also other traditional as like digital infrastructure as well. I think it's also important that there be a time when African countries, can not rely, on foreign investment or foreign aid, let's say, for this basic development needs. But I think we're still a far away from that. And also that many companies, large companies, and also countries understand that they do, have debts to pay to African countries. And so I actually think that there is a need for them, to help democratize and also ensure that AI development is equitable, but also like access to digital technology, is equitable as well. And I think that, there are commitments that have been made, and there should be more, in my opinion. But yeah, it's a bit hard of a question, because I don't see like this independence, from foreign aid or, foreign investment lessening anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kolo. We have run out of time. This has been a very interesting conversation for me. It's unbelievable. AI is a very important topic. It's immense opportunity for Africa, but then there are challenges. But I'm really grateful. Like, we have started a conversation. There's still a lot of questions on ground, personal questions for reflection. And I hope in future times with Kasc, we can still explore these questions. So I'm really grateful for Kasc for the incredible opportunity they have extended to myself and my colleague Seun, And to the speakers, thank you so much. I can't believe we're meeting some of you. And also we appreciate everyone that has joined the meeting. That's been awesome. So you can still reach out to our speakers with questions. I think Dr. Tanya left her email. Yeah, so that is all for today. We really appreciate it. So I'll turn over to Professor Glenn now. Professor Glenn has some information to pass across to us.
Yeah, I just want to mention to people that we will be having in 2 weeks' time on October 30th, October 31st, and November 1st, we're partnering with the Mid-America Alliance for African Studies, which is having their annual conference on the topic of disinformation, misinformation, epistemic violence in Africa. And definitely, if you've seen the New York Times in the last couple of days had an article about disinformation, possibly by somehow Russian sources acting in African context, dissuading people from participating in malaria vaccination. So this kind of will be the topic of that conference. If you're interested in what we had today, that's a very close topic to the one we had today. So I encourage you. It's both virtual and in person. So please check it out. I think that Chibuzor shared the link to our calendar. You can click on that and get more information about the MOS conference coming up in a couple of weeks. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, presenters.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okolo. Thank you, Dr. Tanya. Thank you, Dr. Shegun. Thank you, Professor Opokodu.
Thank you, Korede.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.